Hey everybody, what's going on? Helmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Now, this is not going to be a Milio video per se. I'm gonna still hold off over the weekend to try and get my review of Milio out, but I did want to use Milio as a vessel for talking about another subject in League of Legends, and that is complexity and the myth of overloaded champions. Now, Milio's release has come with a veritable chorus of comments that all follow the general lines of, hey, it's really nice for Riot to finally release a relatively simple champion. Which I wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment. I think that simple champions have their place in League of Legends, and that it is nice to have a bit of variety from the very complex champions that Riot have been releasing more and more often as the game has gotten older. However, and tangentially related to that last part, a lot of people have been following up their praise of Milio by saying, yeah, he's so much better than the overloaded champions that Riot have been releasing lately. Every champion is overloaded, and it's nice to see that Riot finally made a champion that's balanced for a change. As if somehow a complex champion is naturally stronger than a less complex champion. And that sort of stuck with me, and I wanted to make a video today to talk about why complex champions are not a bad thing, and how I actually think they are almost better for League of Legends in general. The first reason why I think more complex champions are better than less complex champions is actually due to a resource, and that is the finite amount of design space that's left in League of Legends. League of Legends has been around for 13 plus years. It's a very old game at this point. There are 163 champions in the game, and as a result, each of these champions has 4 or more distinct, unique abilities. And when the game first came out, of course, Riot were able to slap really simple abilities on basically every single one of their champions because, well, nothing had been done yet. It was easy to take a champion like Annie and say, hey, your Q does magic damage to a target. And that's it. That's all that ability does. Because nothing had ever been done like that before. You could say that, and the fans would be like, okay, cool, that's just the unique Annie thing that she has. And you're probably laughing at the unique thing that she has, but legitimately, that's how it was back then. But now, with 163 champions in the game, the available pool of simple abilities has decreased significantly. You can still do simple abilities, Milio's release sort of points to this, but it's a lot harder to do a simple ability or a simple champion because there just isn't that much design space left. You have to find ways to differentiate abilities from the abilities that already exist in the game, which is why Riot do a lot of skill shot that slows and also does something else, because you can't just say skill shot that slows. That's any number of other champions that already exist in the game, right? People would be comparing it to Braum Q, or to Vel'Koz Q, or to any number of other champion Qs that happen to be skill shots that happen to slow. And as a result, complexity is naturally going to increase. But complexity then is maintaining the available design space of League of Legends. There aren't that many simple designs left in the game, and Riot necessarily have to make their designs more complicated. This isn't a bad thing, though, because more complicated designs have a few advantages over simple ones. Most notably, the complex designs tend to have higher skill ceilings than their less complex counterparts. Think of champions like Annie or Malphite or Garen. These are extremely easy champions to pick up and play. They have a very low skill floor, but their skill ceiling is necessarily capped by the fact that their abilities are just simple. Annie's Q is functionally the same as what I mentioned before. There are a few more lines of text on it now to give her mana back whenever she kills a minion with it and refund some of the cooldown, but functionally it's still damage to a target enemy. Her W is damage to enemies in a cone, right? There just isn't that much that Annie can do with her abilities, and as a result, her utility and her ability to use her abilities in interesting and creative ways to get herself out of or into bad situations is necessarily curtailed as a result of those abilities' simplicity. And you'll find a similar story with Garen, you'll find a similar story with Malphite, you'll find a similar story with any of these other extremely simple champions that were designed back when the game first came out. By comparison, a more complex champion, let's use Yasuo as an example here, has abilities that have a lot more text on them, abilities that are a lot harder to use optimally, that have a lot of different moving components to them that you're allowed to use in different ways. And this means that Yasuo has a lot of different options for when he's confronted with a scenario. He doesn't have to say, all this ability does is damage to a target, that's it, that's all I can use it for. He has a variety of different things that he's allowed to make use of, and allowed to use to structure an engagement in a certain way, or to get himself out of a bad situation, or to set up a team fight for his friends. His abilities have a bigger degree of depth to them than some of these simpler champions. And that makes you also more fun to play, in my opinion at the very least, knowing that your abilities can be used and combined in different ways. Pyke is another really good example of this. Pyke can use his E to gap close in order to go for a tap Q, or use his E to gap close in order to go for a longer Q that throws you behind him, or he can go for a Q to pull you back and then E forwards, and then combine those with his W to get closer to you so he can E at you from stealth, or get closer to you so he can pull you back with a Q and then E through you for a stun. There's all sorts of different ways in which Pyke can combine his abilities, so even though he's a more complex champion than some of the simpler ones, he has a variety of different tools that make him an interesting champion to play, as opposed to the basic champions like Garen, where all Garen can really do is press Q, run at you, spin, and maybe kill you with R, and I'll press W in there someplace, it doesn't really matter, right? That's like the only thing Garen can fundamentally do with his abilities, as opposed to a lot of the other champions in the game. And that's why I think complexity is one of the bigger advantages that more complex champions have. You'll also note that some of these more complex champions, they have a higher ceiling, but they can still have a low floor. Lots of people are able to pick up and play Yasuo. Lots of people are able to pick up and play Zed. That's not a problem for those champions, but they have the necessary depth to then have a high skill ceiling as well, and that's because their abilities are complex. If the only thing Zed has is skill shot that damages enemies and passes through, damage in an AoE, and, I don't know, some other movement ability, that's it. He wouldn't be very interesting. But the cloning aspect of his abilities give him that depth and make him a harder champion to play, yes, but also the kind of champion that can then be rewarding to play and that has the depth to make them an intriguing champion moving forwards. Complex champions also push the boundaries of champion design. As Riot plumb the design space of League of Legends for unique mechanics, they necessarily will have to start reaching into areas that were previously unexplored or even quote-unquote off-limits prior. And this can potentially open you up to brand new design space that you hadn't considered before. As an example, Kalista was made with the intention of champions can't dash between every auto attack. The designer said, why not? And we got Kalista, who did push the design space of League of Legends into places it hadn't been before, especially with her binding mechanic that was then reused on lots of other champions after her. Champions like the Taric rework or Rel when she first came out, right? Those likely got their start from something like Kalista. And as a result, simple designs don't push the boundaries of the game quite as far because they tend to stick to what the tried and true for League of Legends is. Milio is a little bit of an outlier. He does have at least his W's range extension as a way to say, hey, I potentially am doing something that no other champion has done before, but most of his other abilities are abilities or variations on abilities that we've seen previously. They're not doing anything particularly unique, they're just kinda there, and as a result, he doesn't really push the design space in the way that a more complex champion can. Complex champions appeal to players that want a more micro-intensive and skillful experience. We touched on this a little bit before, but these players want a complicated champion. They want the ability to have these tools, but to have to figure out how to use them in the next 3 seconds or they're going to die. And when you're able to do that, there's a big sense of satisfaction and reward for putting in the time to figure out this champion and get to know what they're supposed to do. A simple champion might be fun to pick up and play on occasion, and especially I enjoy simple champion when I'm tired from the day or just don't want to think that hard, but it does mean that there just isn't that much to think about. You'll cap out on your skill on a champion like Garen a lot sooner than you're going to cap out on your skill on a champion like Aurelia. And I think also for a lot of players, they tend to conflate the word overloaded as a synonym for wordy. There's an often quoted argument against modern League of Legends champion design that goes along the lines of Akshan's W tooltip has more words in it than the entirety of Nasus's tooltips combined. And that doesn't mean that Akshan is overloaded. It just means that Riot had to spend a lot of words to properly describe what the ability does. And I would argue that Akshan is a better designed champion than Nasus, even though his ability, one ability, has more words in it than the entirety of Nasus's kit. As an example of what I mean by wordy versus overloaded, Jhin passive, when you first look at it, looks extremely complicated. There are multiple paragraphs and parentheses and different things going on with how Jhin passive works, but when you actually read it, you realize, oh, this isn't actually that complicated. A lot of this is spent on just describing how Jhin uses certain stats in different ways from other carries. And when you play Jhin, it's even simpler. You get 4 shots. The 4th shot crits. You convert attack speed into bonus attack damage. And that's it. There are other lines of text on the ability, of course, and there are on a lot of different champions, but a lot of times these ability, you don't have to know what the text of every single ability is down to the letter. As long as you know generally what it does, it works out fine. So a wordy champion or a wordy ability isn't necessarily indicative that the champion is overloaded. Now, this isn't to say that Riot haven't released overloaded champions in the past. I think Akali, on the launch of her rework, was overloaded. The obscuration mechanic, the super invisibility, why did that need to be on the champion? Regular invisibility serves her just fine. The micro stun on her R1, why did she need that? R1 being free castable, so in order to give her even more mobility, why did that need to be a thing, right? That champion certainly launched overloaded with mechanics that were not necessary on the kit, and that's realistically what we should be looking for on a champion. What are the champion's mechanics, and how do they serve their role? In Akali's case, she didn't need a stun. She's an assassin. You shouldn't have crowd control to interrupt enemy channeled abilities with. In Akali's case, you shouldn't have obscuration. Regular invisibility works just fine. Her ability to stand under your tower and be immune to damage is really kind of crazy. And those are the things that you want to be looking for, more so than just how long is the tooltip, because that doesn't necessarily matter. As it's sort of another example of this, Alawi's E has a very long tooltip. It's a complicated ability, admittedly, but she's not overloaded, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone complain that Alawi is overloaded. Just because her tooltip is long doesn't mean she has any assets or tools or abilities that take her away from her core experience. She just is what she is, and what she is not a very complicated champion at the end of the day. And so, what I want to kind of summarize here is complexity is fine. And I think that complex champions tend to be better designed than simple champions. I think simplicity is something that Riot can try to inject in the game every now and again, but that's going to happen less and less commonly, so we should not only get used to complex champions, but I think welcome them in. I do think that overloading exists, but I think that the people who are throwing around the word overloaded are using it without really looking at the champion and saying, what tools do they have on them, and are these tools justified? They just see a lot of words in a tooltip and say, overloaded, without actually having processed what it is the champion does. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this down in the comment section below, especially if you think Milio is a perfect kind of champion design that Riot should do more of, or if you agree, like me, that we should get more complicated champions. Let me know all that down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.